Lossie Peterson was a vibrant 27-year-old woman who lived in Modesto, California with her husband, Scott Peterson. They appeared to have an idyllic life, living in a quaint 3-bedroom bungalow in an upscale neighborhood near East La Loma Park. Lacey, who was 8 months pregnant, was eagerly anticipating the birth of their first child, a boy they had decided to name Connor. She was a beloved member of her community, known for her warmth, charm, and devotion to family and friends. Lacey and Scott had met at California Polytechnic State University, where Scott studied agricultural business and Lacey pursued ornamental horticulture. They dated for 2 years before marrying in 1997 at the Sycamore Mineral Springs Resort. After their wedding, they moved to San Luis Obispo, where they opened a sports bar called The Shack. Their entrepreneurial venture was initially successful, but they eventually sold the bar in April 2001 to move to Modesto and start a family. In Modesto, Lossie embraced her role as a homemaker, enjoying activities like cooking, entertaining, and gardening. She took a part-time job as a substitute teacher while Scott worked for Trade Corp USA, a fertilizer company, earning $5,000 a month. The couple's home was always immaculate, reflecting Lossie's meticulous nature and passion for creating a welcoming environment. She was deeply involved in preparing for the arrival of their son, having already decorated the nursery and frequently indulging in baby-related shopping sprees. Scott Peterson, meanwhile, projected the image of a dedicated husband and soon-to-be father. However, beneath this veneer lay a series of troubling behaviors and secrets. Scott had a history of extramarital affairs, the most recent being with Amber Frey, a massage therapist from Fresno. Amber, who was unaware that Scott was married, would later be a key figure in the investigation. On the evening of December 23, 2002, Lacey and Scott visited Salon, where Lacey's sister Amy Rocha worked. Amy cut Scott's hair, a monthly routine. During this visit, Scott mentioned that he would pick up a fruit basket for Amy the next day because he would be playing golf near the retailer. This detail would later become significant, as it was part of Scott's alibi for the day Lacey disappeared. The following day, Christmas Eve, Scott claimed he left home around 9:30 a.m., heading to the Berkeley Marina to go fishing. He told investigators that Lacey was watching a Martha Stewart show about marrying and preparing to mop the floor, bake cookies, and walk the family dog, Mackenzie. Scott's version of events included leaving a voicemail for Lacey around 2:15 p.m., stating, "Hey beautiful, it's 2:15. I'm leaving Berkeley." Around 10:30 a.m. on December 24th, Karen Service, a neighbor, found Mackenzie wandering the neighborhood with a muddy leash. She returned the dog to the Petersons' backyard. Later, another neighbor, Mike Chiavetta, also saw Mackenzie outside around 10:45 a.m. By the early afternoon, Scott returned home to find Lacey's car in the driveway, but the house empty. He showered and washed his clothes, explaining that he had gotten wet while fishing. When Lacey failed to return home, Scott called her mother, Sharon Rocha, to see if Lacey was with her. Upon learning Lacey was missing, Sharon and Lacey's stepfather, Ron Gransky, contacted the Modesto Police Department, and detectives Alan Brocchini and John Buehler were assigned to the case. They arrived at the Peterson home on the evening of December 24, 2002. Inside the house, they found Lossie's keys, wallet, and sunglasses on the counter, her purse in a closet, and a phone book open to a full-page ad for a defense lawyer. These items indicated that Lacey had not left the house voluntarily. Scott's behavior during these initial interactions with the police raised suspicions. He was reportedly calm and cooperative, but his demeanor struck the detectives as unusual for a man whose pregnant wife was missing. He told the detectives that he had last seen Lacey around 9:30 a.m. when he left for a solo fishing trip at the Berkeley Marina. Scott's story about his activities that day included detailed descriptions of the fishing trip and his interactions with people he encountered at the marina, but his alibi was soon scrutinized. At the time of her disappearance, Lacey was 7.5 months pregnant, and the story quickly attracted national media attention. The initial hours and days of the investigation were crucial, as authorities began to piece together the timeline and circumstances surrounding Lassie's last known activities. The Modesto Police Department quickly mobilized search efforts. Volunteers and law enforcement officers canvassed the neighborhood, distributing flyers with Lassie's picture and searching nearby parks and waterways. Search dogs were brought in, and helicopters equipped with infrared sensors scanned the area. The community rallied, with hundreds of volunteers assisting in the search. The police set up a command center to coordinate the extensive search efforts, which were covered extensively by local and national media. As the search continued, investigators focused on Scott's alibi and behavior. They learned that Scott had purchased a boat on December 9th, just weeks before Lassie disappeared, but had not mentioned this to anyone. He had taken the boat out for a test run on December 20th, a fact he had also kept to himself. Investigators found it odd that Scott, an avid golfer, would choose to go fishing alone on Christmas Eve, a day typically spent with family. In the days following Lassie's disappearance, Scott's inconsistencies became more apparent. He initially told people he had been golfing on Christmas Eve, only to later change his story to fishing. Scott's interactions with the media also drew attention. During a candlelight vigil for Lassie, he was spotted laughing and joking, behavior considered inappropriate given the circumstances. Moreover, Scott sold Lassie's car and inquired about selling their home just days after she went missing, actions that seemed premature and callous. As the investigation progressed, police discovered Scott's extramarital affair with Amber Frey, a massage therapist from Fresno. Amber had met Scott on November 20th, 2002, through a mutual friend. Scott had told her he was single and had lost his wife. On December 30th, 2002, Amber contacted the Modesto Police Department after learning about Lassie's disappearance and Scott's deceit. She agreed to cooperate with the investigation and allowed the police to record their phone conversations. The recordings provided critical evidence. In these conversations, Scott continued to lie to Amber about his marital status, even after Lassie was reported missing. He did not disclose that his wife was missing and expressed no concern over the situation. Instead, Scott maintained a romantic and carefree demeanor, further implicating himself in the eyes of investigators and the public. As weeks turned into months, the search for Lassie Peterson continued with no significant breakthroughs. The media's intense focus on the case kept it in the public eye, and suspicions about Scott Peterson's involvement grew stronger. The police meticulously pieced together the timeline of Lassie's last known movements and Scott's activities on the day of her disappearance, but they lacked the concrete evidence needed to make an arrest. In April 2003, nearly 4 months after Lassie's disappearance, a gruesome discovery was made that would change the course of the investigation. On April 13th, a couple walking their dog along the San Francisco Bay shore near the Berkeley Marina found the decomposed body of a late-term male fetus. The next day, the body of a recently pregnant woman was found washed ashore about a mile away. The remains were badly decomposed, but it was clear that the woman had been pregnant, and the fetus had been expelled from her body after death, likely due to the natural processes that occur after a pregnant woman dies. DNA testing confirmed what many had feared. The bodies were those of Lassie Peterson and her unborn son Connor. The location of their discovery was chillingly close to where Scott had claimed to be fishing on December 24, 2002. This revelation cast an even darker shadow over Scott Peterson, who had been under intense scrutiny from both the media and law enforcement since Lassie's disappearance. The discovery of the bodies provided the physical evidence needed to arrest Scott Peterson. On April 18, 2003, Scott was apprehended near a La Jolla golf course. At the time of his arrest, Scott had dyed his hair blonde, grown a goatee, and had with him nearly $15,000 in cash, several credit cards belonging to his family members, and multiple cell phones. These items suggested to investigators that Scott was preparing to flee, further implicating him in the eyes of the public and the authorities. Scott Peterson was charged with 2 felony counts of murder on April 21, 2003, for the deaths of Lassie and Connor. The charges specified that Scott faced first degree for taking Lacey's life and second degree for the death of Connor. The decision to charge Scott with Connor's death as a separate count was made possible by California's fetal homicide law, which allows for the prosecution of individuals who'd unalive a fetus that has reached a certain stage of development. The prosecution's case against Scott Peterson hinged on several key pieces of evidence. First, there was the timeline of Scott's activities on the day Lacey disappeared, which included the suspicious circumstances of his fishing trip. Investigators believed that Scott had used his newly purchased boat to dispose of Lacey's body in the bay. Second, there was the affair with Amber Frey, which provided a motive for the crime. Amber's recorded conversations with Scott were particularly damning, as they revealed his deceit and lack of concern for his missing wife. The trial of Scott Peterson began on June 1, 2004, in Redwood City, California. Due to the extensive media coverage and public interest in the case, it was decided that the trial would be moved from Modesto to ensure a fair trial. The trial was presided over by Judge Alfred DeLucci, and the lead prosecutor was Rick DiStasso, while Scott's defense was handled by high-profile attorney Mark Geragos. During the trial, the prosecution presented a compelling narrative that Scott had killed Lacey to escape the constraints of marriage and impending fatherhood. They argued that Scott wanted to be free to continue his affair with Amber Frey and pursue other romantic interests. The prosecution introduced evidence of Scott's deceit, his purchase of the boat, and the suspicious timing of his activities on the day Lacey disappeared. They also highlighted Scott's behavior in the days and weeks following Lacey's disappearance, including his attempts to sell their house and his apparent lack of concern for Lacey's well-being. The defense, on the other hand, argued that the evidence against Scott was purely circumstantial. They suggested that Lacey could have been abducted and murdered by someone else, pointing to reports of suspicious individuals in the neighborhood on the day she disappeared. The defense also challenged the prosecution's timeline and questioned the credibility of some of the witnesses. They argued that the lack of direct evidence linking Scott to the crime should result in his acquittal. Despite the defense's efforts, the jury found Scott Peterson guilty of first-degree murder for the death of Lacey Peterson and second-degree murder for the death of Connor Peterson. The verdict was delivered on November 12, 2004. On March 16, 2005, Scott was sentenced to death by lethal injection and was sent to San Quentin State Prison to await execution. Amber Frey's cooperation with the police and her testimony had been instrumental in building the case against Scott Peterson. After the trial, Amber Frey wrote a book titled Witness for the prosecution of Scott Peterson, in which she detailed her relationship with Scott and her experiences during the investigation and trial. The book provided further insights into her perspective and the emotional toll the case had on her. Amber also made several public appearances and interviews, discussing her role in the case and advocating for victims of deceit and domestic violence. The public's reaction to the case's conclusion was deeply divided. On one hand, many people were convinced of his guilt, swayed by the circumstantial evidence and Scott's suspicious behavior. On the other hand, some members of the public and certain commentators believed that Scott Peterson might be innocent or that he had not received a fair trial. They argued that the evidence against him was circumstantial and that the media frenzy had biased public opinion and potentially the jury. The high-profile nature of the case also sparked discussions about the role of the media in the justice system, particularly regarding the presumption of innocence until proven guilty. After Scott Peterson's conviction and sentencing, the case continued to make headlines. In 2020, his death sentence was overturned by the California Supreme Court due to juror misconduct during the penalty phase of the trial. The court ruled that the trial judge had improperly dismissed prospective jurors who expressed opposition to the death penalty but indicated they could follow the law and impose it if necessary. This decision led to a new penalty phase trial being ordered, although Scott's conviction for the murders of Lacey and Connor was upheld. In recent years, the Los Angeles Innocence Project has taken up Scott Peterson's case, arguing that there is new evidence that could exonerate him. The Innocence Project claims that Scott's state and federal constitutional rights were violated and that critical evidence from the original trial was mishandled or overlooked. They have filed motions seeking access to this evidence, and their involvement has reignited public interest and debate about Scott's guilt and the integrity of the original investigation and trial. One of the key arguments presented by the Innocence Project involves allegations of juror misconduct during the original trial. They argue that one of the jurors, known as Strawberry Shortcake due to her red hair, failed to disclose her own history of domestic violence, which could have influenced her judgment. This juror's omission, they claim, violated Scott's right to an impartial jury, a cornerstone of the judicial process. In parallel, Scott's family has remained vocal in their support, consistently arguing that he was wrongfully convicted. They have maintained a public presence, advocating for his release and emphasizing what they perceive as flaws in the investigation and trial. The Peterson family's efforts have been crucial in keeping the case in the public eye and attracting support from legal organizations and individuals who believe in Scott's innocence. The Scott Peterson case has had far-reaching implications beyond the immediate legal battles. It has prompted discussions about the death penalty, the reliability of circumstantial evidence, and the potential for wrongful convictions. Legal experts and commentators have used the case to highlight the importance of rigorous forensic analysis, the need for impartial juries, and the ethical responsibilities of media coverage in high-profile cases. Furthermore, the case has influenced legal practices and reforms. The extensive media coverage and public interest have led to calls for stricter guidelines on how such cases are reported, aiming to prevent undue influence on public opinion and the judicial process. There have also been discussions about juror screening processes to ensure that individuals with potential biases are identified and excluded from serving on juries. As Scott Peterson's legal team continues to fight for a new trial or exoneration, the case remains a focal point for debates about justice, fairness, and the complexities of the American legal system. The ongoing developments ensure that the legacy of the Peterson case will endure, serving as both a cautionary tale and a catalyst for change in how criminal cases are investigated, prosecuted, and reported.